Oh, it's over there. Are we good? Oh, no? Oh, we are good to go. Oh, we are. Hi. Hello. I'm going to move this a bit closer to me than normal to make up for the backing music outside. So do shout if ever you can't make out what we're saying. Hello and welcome to this morning event, Conservative Home, in partnership with Atos, talking about cyber security. Obviously, a hugely important issue. Not only have recent events shown that authoritarian regimes are increasingly using digital threats to expand their non-conventional arsenal, but also, on a more conventional note, more and more devices are connected and therefore attackable by digital means. So the question is, how can we make the United Kingdom, British businesses and British people better protected from these kind of threats? Joining me is Tom Tugendhat. Sorry, actually is impossible. Tom Tugendhat, the Minister for Security, Colville Ranger from Atos, and Simon Fell, the Chair of the APPG for Cyber Security. I'm sure you all know the format by now. Our panel will speak. We will then have a short discussion, and then we will throw questions out to the floor. There will be microphones coming to you. Again, I am sorry about the noise outside. Please project and make sure that everybody can hear what you're saying. Thank you very much. First off, Tom.
Thank you very much indeed. Look, it's an enormous pleasure to be here today. It's a pleasure to support Con Home, which is, if those of you haven't been reading it, it's what determines the electoral outcomes of internal elections in the Conservative Party. And it's a great pleasure to therefore be here supporting such an august institution. It's also a great pleasure to be with Colville, with whom I've done a few things in the past, and Simon, who's been a very dear friend for a number of years, so I'm very pleased to be with them. Look, we are in a very different world that many of you will know better than me, but we're in a world that has changed from physical threats to online threats. And the most obvious demonstration of this really is when you look at the nature of crime in this country. And the reality of crime in this country is that much of it, not all of it, but much of it is falling. It's falling in physical areas, it's falling in burglary, it's falling in things like that. Where it's rising is in fraud. It's rising in online crime. And this isn't the whole of the cyber threat. This is only part of it. But it's a useful indicator to remind ourselves that actually this is a very real attack on homes and families across the United Kingdom. It's not theoretical, it's actual. Families across our country are losing hundreds, sometimes sadly thousands of pounds to online criminals. And it's not just crime. Because the reality is that sadly the transnational nature of it and the connection to state actors means that some of this crime is not just criminality in the theft end, but in the spending as well. It goes into terrorism, it goes into drugs, it goes into, sadly, in some extraordinary and rather unusual, thank God, cases, it goes into funding nuclear weapons programs in North Korea or into supporting different state actors in different areas. So it really is a very, very major threat, not just to us as individuals, but to us as a free society as well. And that's where the work of my department, and I'm very pleased to say my department, is really beginning to focus. Because the online safety of our citizens is absolutely crucial to maintaining the online safety of our country. So you'll know, I hope, that we're introducing the National Security Bill and the Economic Crime Bill. But it's worth talking about what runs behind them. What runs behind them is a very strong idea that we need to be as protected online as we are off, and to make sure that the different kinds of ransomware that are being used, the different kinds of criminality that are being undergone online are stopped, and the way in which we prosecute really brings into line the different levels of threat that we see across the country. So, now I know that other people will want to talk, so I will begin to wrap up shortly. But it's worth pointing out that there's already an estimated 1.6 million incidents of cybercrime in England and Wales as of last year, which is an 89% increase, but the reality is that masks an awful lot. It masks an awful lot because we still don't have, in this country sadly, a culture of reporting that we would need to see to have really honest figures on this. What we need to see is much more openness to the reality that actually these threats are not just a reflection on the individual, but a reflection on the society. And so what we need to be doing is making sure that while all of us have a responsibility, I hope you all do this, for things like two-factor authentication and making sure that your email is protected and making sure you don't log on to unknown Wi-Fi and things like that. You also realise that we as a state have a responsibility to intervene more broadly. So I think there's an awful lot that we have got to invest in, and I'm very glad that we are doing so. Now, I can run through a whole bunch of statistics, but I think I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to focus on one last point. I'm going to focus on the fact that there is a change in understanding as to where this needs to lie. Because much of this technology has previously gone through the Foreign Office in GCHQ for obvious reasons, or it's gone through the Cabinet Office. But increasingly, this is going through the Home Office. Now, you may say this is just a bureaucratic change, and to some extent, of course, that is correct. But it's an important one. It's an important one because it shows that this is now being seen, quite rightly, I think, as an individual threat, a threat to our domestic security at home and across the nation. And so the level of emphasis that we are beginning to put on this, I think, has increased enormously. And I look forward to taking it forward, because this is, sadly, only going to grow unless we take the action we need to make ourselves safer.
Thank you very much. Simon.
Thank you. And thank you to Conservative Home and ATOS as well for sponsoring this. This is a really important subject for us to be covering, and I'm glad to see so many people sat here to listen to us. I've just come from a BBC World event where we've been talking about soft power and the importance of institutions like the BBC World Service, and it strikes me that cybersecurity is another one of those areas where we forget about it until something goes wrong, but actually decent cybersecurity underpins so much of the world we live in now, from how our power is generated to the IT systems that keep devices like this working, to the software that allows us to stream events like this over the internet. It's very easy for them to be knocked, and they're very, very fragile indeed, and fixing them and making them resilient for the future means investment, not just in technical fixes, but in people too, and in skills. So I chair the cybersecurity group in Parliament. We look at a whole range of things. We've done investigations into universities and where funding for universities comes from, and what that might mean in terms of the output of research and the resilience of some of the research that is done in those institutions. We've looked at supply chains and how those can be used as attack vectors by hostile foreign states. We've looked at aid spending and how that can be used to channel misinformation and drive attacks into government departments. The group is open to all, so if you're interested, come and grab me afterwards and I'll sign you up quite happily. It's free to join. But I think the key thing that I would like to lay out is that we live in an interconnected world. We talk time and time again, the example that's often used is the WannaCry attack, which hit the NHS really badly a few years ago. But the WannaCry attack wasn't an attack on the NHS, it was an attack on outdated Microsoft software systems. And the NHS has a knackered IT system, so it was very, very easy to infiltrate it and cause havoc. The NotPetya attack, which was targeted at Maersk, cost them 230 million. Now, that's a huge cost for any organisation to try and shoulder. But of course, their systems are connected to everyone else's. As that attack ran across the internet, ran across connected services, it knocked out organisation after organisation, and the estimated global cost of that single attack, which was a weaponised attack from an organisation sponsored by a hostile state, cost $15 billion. So if you think this is something which is small and that unless you're interested in IT problems doesn't affect you, you're very, very wrong indeed. I should praise a lot of what the government's been doing. So Steve Barclay, when he was in the Cabinet Office, launched a cybersecurity strategy for the UK and for the government. I think these are solid pieces of work and things we can be building on with the online harms, with the DPA and the AI action plan. But we need to be looking at how we're building these skills in the future and how we're making ourselves more resilient. The areas I would really like Tom to be focusing on, hope you're paying attention, Tom, SMEs, I think they are a particular area of vulnerability. My background is fraud and financial crime. The argument I would always use in that space was the person who is often responsible for an organization's cyber fraud protections is also the person who empties the bins and cleans the office at night. They don't often have the headspace and the time to think about some of these really, really difficult issues. And we have a role as government to step in and make sure that we are giving them easy to digest advice and best practice on a plate. Otherwise, those attacks can cause our entrepreneurs serious problems. And then the other thing is skills. We need to make sure that we are building the skills for the future so that people know how to deal with these challenges. Some Norwegian countries have got a really interesting model of cyber specials where they second people out from industry into state to help prevent against attacks. I think we should be looking at that. And I think there's also, my final thought is on partnership and opportunities here. We keep hearing again and again from the government that we are now a growth government, and that is what we are going for. I was in Morocco a little while ago talking to the Moroccan equivalent of the MOD as we launched the International Cybersecurity Centre there. Talking to their defence ministers, they are desperate to have a partnership with the West on cybersecurity issues because they recognise that interconnected point. They recognise the fact that an attack against us is an attack against them, and they are far less able to deal with it as a nation state than we are. So there's an opportunity here for us to forge new international partnerships, and I think we should be going at those full tilt.
Thank you very much. Colville.
Thanks, Henry, and good morning, everyone. And isn't it great to be accompanied by talking heads when you're trying to say something as a talking head? My name is Kilvir Ranger. I'm from Atos. And actually, this music is quite interesting because this is the level of disruption that's going on in our world, which we don't notice. These are the attacks in the background that are happening, and we can just ignore it. We can tune it out. But it's having an impact on us. Obviously, it's having an impact on us psychologically. It's deep messaging. It's having some kind of detrimental effect on our lives. And that's a prime example of what's happening in the world of cybersecurity. But before I get into that, a word from our sponsor, as they say. I am from Atos. Why are we here? We're the European leader in managed cybersecurity services. We're number one, and that's through volume, and that's via Gartner's accreditation, and we're number two globally. But what does that really mean? And what it means is that we work with many other businesses. We provide a B2B service, managing systems, managing data, but inherent in all of the service is security and safety. There is no service that is worth its corner if it isn't secure. And that's because trust, confidence, and reputation of any service delivery depends on how secure it is. We can all bamboozle you with lots of figures of the size and scale and the fear of what's going on out there. But to make it a bit real, we've spent the last 30 years in partnership supporting the International Olympic Committee. So every Olympic Games, we're the prime IT provider, which fundamentally means bringing all the systems together, but it actually means keeping it safe. And I can tell you at the Tokyo Games, on average, there were about 450 million attacks coming in on a daily basis to that one event. And by the way, we can also know where these attacks are coming from. It's no secret which states are fostering, harboring, and encouraging this kind of disruption. So we have a huge role to play, but actually I want to also boil it back down to individuals. Because I've been very fortunate. I've spent 25 years in industry. And during the course, I've been able to work on very interesting projects, one of which was working with many, many people. I did not do this myself, I have to put that on the record, was the delivery of the Oyster card in London. And if you can cast your mind back, that was 2003. Now, I can bore you senseless with some detail about that particular project, but the point I want to make about it is data. It was the first time that a Western city, a kind of infrastructure, transport infrastructure, was about to capture all kinds of data about people's movements, transaction, and something called e-money. We take this all for granted now. But in 2003, this was revolutionary. And the response to the question, what are we going to do with this data, was absolutely nothing. We're going to bury it. We're going to put it in a vault and lock it. because we were getting questions saying, what will happen? How will people will know when I got on the train, when I got off the train, or how much I spent, or what time I left the office? All kinds of interesting facts and features that could become vulnerabilities. So that was 2003. You fast forwarded a decade, and in those 25 years, I was fortunate to spend 4 years working for Boris Johnson when he was Mayor of London. And at that point, I held the transport brief, and we were asked, you know that data that TfL is collecting? Maybe we can do something with it. Maybe we can gamify it. Maybe we can look at patterns. We can look at managing the operation of the systems better and various other things, all great value. But to do that, you had to unlock it. And if you unlock it, suddenly it becomes vulnerable, susceptible to attack. The landscape changes. That was a massive step. And what we talk about now is that kind of step, that step change in thinking, in making data available and accessible, happening at lightning speed almost every day. Because I think Simon mentioned it, connectivity. The connectivity that we all now are literally taking for granted. 5 years ago, I was talking about a personal digital ecosystem that we'd all created without realizing. And what that means, we've all got our own hardware. We carry these things around with us, the devices. We're all paying for connectivity, your 5G, your broadband, so you've created your hardware, your network, and we're also logging into platforms. Now, it used to be Facebook, but now it might be TikTok, and so on and so forth. So platforms, hardware, connectivity, our own individual personal ecosystem, which we've created, and everyone comes into to sell us things, to give us information, but also it's a vulnerability. And that landscape is exponentially growing when our car is now connected to it, where our home is connected to it. As Simon said, my heating system, my car, and everything else is run from here. It's happened. But that means the vulnerability is expanded. And that's for the individual, that's for business, but it's also for the state. And I think the one example I'll talk about right now about the state, and we'll come on to probably many others, is state services coming through a digital platform. It's fantastic when the government gets things right and tells you about your booster that you should go and get, and you get a text message, or in fact you're going to get your energy rebate, and don't do it, that's going to come through, and you suddenly, as soon as these things are announced, there's a plethora of text messages and emails that come to you. They look very official, that tell you the government has done something, but can you just click here to confirm that you want this? That is those bad actors immediately harnessing the power and piggybacking on the state to start to attack us as individuals. And if you think about the size and scale of how state services are being hijacked, that's something that we have to look at very cautiously as we go forward, because we want more digital services, we want more engagement, the efficiency that technology provides for public services, but we need to look at the vulnerabilities it opens up as well. So there's plenty of good things going on, and it's always in these conversations difficult not to drag everybody down and think, oh, woe is me, it's all terrible. There's plenty of great stuff going on, and us being ahead of it. But I think, as Simon said, the couple of things I'd call on the minister, and Tom, forgive me, I'll say pretty much the same again, is partnership. The effective workings between public sector, private sector, to look at these vulnerabilities before they materialize is essential. Early working on the design. Simon said skills, absolutely. If it's not number one, it's definitely number two, skills. We have a dearth of skills. We have 6,000 special cybersecurity experts in our business. We could easily double, triple, quadruple that number and still not meet the requirement that we need. So we need to really focus on how can we turbocharge the skills in this area. And finally, coming back to that example I gave, reporting, especially when it comes to public services. How can we, if we get that text message, if we get that rogue email, how can we simply report it and then get something done about it? Because I think we really need to have a culture that encourages that as well. So I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions, and as I said, anything on the Oyster card, happy to discuss, but maybe outside of this event. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Colville. I will open the floor to questions in a minute. There will be two speakers coming out. I'm just going to usurp Chair's prerogative first to ask a few myself. First of all, Tom, one of the big state actors, maybe the biggest state actor after China that we've heard a lot about over the last few years has been Russia when it comes to malignant cyber attacks. But what has the recent conflict in Ukraine shown? Because has it shown that Russia was a bit of a paper tiger in that regard? It has in pretty much every other sphere, as far as we can see. Or is there, is it still actually a live and active threat to Ukraine ourselves?
I think what that has shown is that the Ukrainians are extremely good at cyber defense, frankly. I think the Ukrainian government and tech firms have done absolutely phenomenal job in defending themselves. And this is where Culver and Simon are absolutely right. This is a public-private partnership, as we used to call it. The Ukrainian businesses who have stepped up to protect everything from their hospitals to their electricity networks to their security infrastructure has been phenomenal. It's also worth noting that Elon Musk and his Starlink system has really made an extraordinary difference. You know, he has connected the internet into parts of Ukraine which would otherwise have been cut off. And you know, I think the point about partnership that both the other panelists have made is absolutely right. The same, by the way, is true here in the United Kingdom. You know, the reality is that the government can only do so much. Much of the cyber defence that we must do ourselves, either, as I said already at the beginning, you know, making sure that we do use the various protections. Our password is not password and things like that, which you will be surprised how many people it still is. After that, the government needs to not just do its own thing through the National Cybersecurity Centre or through GCHQ, but in partnership with businesses. And this is where, you know, there are companies, Atos is one, but there are many companies around the United Kingdom that do an extraordinary job in making sure that we are protected. Now, is Russia a paper tiger? No, I'm afraid it's not. They really do have some pretty extraordinary cyber capabilities. They invest an awful lot in it, and they do things that are grossly irresponsible and could quite easily lead to enormous amounts of pain and suffering, often by accident, because they are extremely reckless in the way that they cyber attack. So, you know, the way in which they'll enter a computer system may well lead to other failures that they didn't intend. And that could lead to different problems. So let's not pretend that there is any responsibility coming out of Moscow towards Ukraine or towards the West. There isn't. It's entirely reckless and it's entirely incautious. And you know, thank God for the skill of the Ukrainian and other cyber experts who are defending us.
Yep. Thank you. So, I'm going to a question for you on fraud, because I think you've done some quite a bit of work on this in the past. I've previously worked with some MPs who did stuff on this in Parliament. What do you think the government needs to be doing in order to try and help? Because it's an incredibly difficult area, fraud, especially cyber fraud, because victims often don't want to come forward. They prey on the vulnerable. What more can government be doing to help people, especially older people perhaps, stay ahead of cyber fraud, to engage with this very difficult topic to make sure that people aren't, you know, attacked?
Thank you. You rolled the pitch for me there. I appreciate that. I'm just going to be really cheeky.
It's close to my heart. I worked on it for 3 years.
I'm just going to be really cheeky and answer Tom's question as well first.
Well, go ahead.
So in April this year, the Foreign Office reported that China had tried to hack 600 Ukrainian websites in the run-up to the war. This is China doing it, not Russia doing it. You know, we've got
maybe working together.
And you've got to be cognizant of the threat. I went to a briefing at FCDO about this, and they said one of the strengths in Ukraine is the fact they didn't have the same sort of interconnected society that we have. So they don't have the systems to hack that we do. And it's interesting, if you talk to folk in the MOD, they see our advanced technologies as one of our risks. So Russia will happily send up dumb satellites into the sky to just go and knock one of our satellites out of orbit and stop them working, because they don't have the reliance on them that we do. So sometimes our technology brings with it these vulnerabilities, and resilience is a key part of what the state needs to be doing, and you know, providing that backup, so we're not reliant on a single service. On fraud, the best thing we can be doing is creating a reporting tool that actually works. We have Action Fraud. Those of us who've... There we go, laughter from the audience. Thank you very much. Clearly you've used it. Those of us who have toiled in the fraud world for a decade in my time will recognise most people call it inaction fraud. You report, it disappears into a black hole. It's not a great mechanism for building faith that something's actually going to happen when you're a victim of fraud. So we need a better reporting mechanism. We need actual action following from that, so people know that if their fingers are burned, if they're caught, committing fraud, they will be picked up, they will be penalised for it, and I think there are mechanisms to do that. The organisation I used to work for, I won't name them, I am not being paid by them, but we used to collect 300,000 reports of confirmed fraud a year and send them off to the police. Next to nothing happened to them. But there is a very easy mechanism you could imagine where if you get repeated marks against your name because we know you have done it, we know when you did it, we know who you did it against, you get the equivalent of an ASBO, an economic ASBO. Do this again and we will come back and we will hit you even harder. We need that resilience in the system. The other thing is awareness. Most people simply don't know how to protect themselves, what the risks are. This really worries me with children. I spend a lot of time talking to young people in schools, and I chair the political literacy group where we try and educate children about the risks. They spend their lives online posting information about themselves, which makes them incredibly vulnerable. You know, when I first started in the fraud world, we used to have a campaign called Beware What You Share, which is basically don't throw away bank statements in the bin without shredding them, because a fraudster can just go through your bins and get those details. Now we're all online. You don't need to go through someone's bins. You just search on Facebook. You find out what your mother's maiden name is. You find out your dates of birth, when you've left your home, when you haven't. It's so easy to get this information, and we need to be, from the earliest age, educating people about what they share, how they share it, and how they protect themselves. That's the best defence we can take.
Tom, an economic ASBO for fraudsters.
I think that's an interesting idea, actually. I have to say it's not one I'd heard before, but I think it's certainly an interesting idea. The reality about education, I think, is absolutely vital, and Simon's completely right about that. You know, there are many of us, I'm not looking at anybody in particular in the room, but there's many of us here who were able to have a private life for many, many years. Because when we were at school and university, not everything that we did was photographed, recorded, shared online, and all the rest of it. I don't know about you, but many people I talk to now tell me that the first thing that employers do is they Google an individual. And I'm sure I'm alone in this room, but some of us did stupid things when we were younger. And if they come back to haunt you the whole time, that can make life very difficult. Now, we need to have that education starting right from the beginning, and information, education and explanation, I think, are part of the role of government. And but they're not just up to government, they're also up to families and schools and businesses. And I think what Simon's talking about is extremely sensible.
Thank you. And one last question before we go to the floor. Colvia, we've had a lot from the panel so far about the importance of government working with business, both in Simon's speech and especially the experience from Ukraine. From your experience on the business side, what more could government be doing to work with commercial partners to improve cybersecurity?
I think the number one thing I would suggest is the earlier engagement in design. And there has been, and you know, this is not criticism, government has done a lot in this area. The development of software systems, in-house building of capability has been great. But the issue is, and we say this as Atos, nobody has all the answers. And one of the things government shouldn't do is think that it can design the entirety of a safety system, a full end-to-end system. You know, there are world-class programmers and people out there. And dare I say, government can't afford to employ them. And it needs to tap into that talent. But it needs to do it in an open way. It needs to be earlier, it needs to engage in terms of bringing that talent not into government, but utilising it while it's outside government. And I think that's the key message here, because I've seen the shift over the years. But if governments do anything, whichever governments they are, there's a great idea, we'll do it ourselves. Now, Her Majesty's government, now how brilliant it is, will not be able to compete with every government in the world or even the best businesses in the world to do it themselves. So it's about leveraging that. But just also, Henry, on a point about stupid things, Tom, we all may have done stupid things, but it's also the unintentional collection of data that's going on, which isn't stupid. It's how many people, when they're trying to get to look at something they want to buy or an article they want to read, suddenly something comes up and says, oh, could you just tick this cookie thing? Because we need to just have your acceptance that you're okay with the data that we're capturing about you. And you think, should I, shouldn't I? But you click it and you move through. The data and the tracking that is being collected on us is just undefendable sometimes. And we've really got to look at that in terms of why businesses are doing it and how do we get the understanding and the culture set, the digital culture mindset that says, I need to acknowledge this, but I need to understand what's happening here. Now, it sounds like it's a big deal. It is a big deal, but let's be honest. We are now a digital society. Every single element of our lives is digital. So we must think of it as a digital first, digital culture, a digital society. Therefore, if we ignore these things, there is a consequence. It's like the plastic bottle being thrown into the ocean. You know, the occasional one, we think it's fine, but somewhere there's a real problem building up. And I think that's where cookies and data being collected unintentionally about us is a real problem.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, we're going to open up to, oh, a sea of hands, lovely. Quick bit of housekeeping. Please, no statements. No statements. Questions, not statements, and relatively short and concise questions, please. There's a lot of people who'd like to speak. It's courteous and it helps us get through. So I think we'll have the lady at the back there with her hand raised. And do we have a second microphone? We do. The gentleman in the front row. You, sir. Thank you. Please say your name and where you're from, if you're from an organisation. Thank you.
Jen Person, Defend Digital. We work in children's data and privacy and digital rights. Question on the education sector per se and its increasing ransomware attacks. What can be done by government to support the education sector? And particularly for the minister, is it not ironic and must you not stand up for the scrapping of the call for backdoors and weakening encryption in the online safety bill? And make sure that private messaging is not subject to behavioural monitoring.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Graham Hutton, Newcastle-under-Lyme chair of the Conservative Association. Recently I had some fraud. I noticed on my Visa card two items from a company I'd never heard of, reported it to my bank. After about half an hour of quizzing me, they accepted it was fraud. And I said, do I need to report it to the police? They said, no, thanks. All you have to do is report it to us. And that was the end of it. They refunded me, but I have no idea what happened after that. So perhaps the banks are something that perhaps the government needs to talk to or the industry needs to talk to. Because are they reporting it? And as far as I'm aware, they're not. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll start with Simon.
Thank you. Another easy one for me. They are reporting it, so that would go straight to action fraud, and then nothing would happen with it. But it is being reported. Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to address the other question?
Education, I think that's probably
Okay.
slightly more one for Tom, but I agree with your point. I think we've got to be really careful about what we're trying to achieve with some of these objectives. So end-to-end encryption does, of course, cause risk to government and the state. You know, this is how, I have a far-right problem in my constituency. This is how they communicate with each other, and they manage to cut the intelligence services and the cops out of those communications by using these encrypted messages. But if you weaken that security, you weaken it for everyone. And finding the balance between there is really, really difficult. So I'm just going to hand that nicely to Tom.
I will pick up that teetering seesaw and probably send it into a spin. Look, encryption is a really difficult problem because the reality is that you can't legislate against mathematics, and that's all that encryption is. We need to find a way in which the commonly used platforms have responsibility for the content and for allowing the communications that they allow. We need to find ways in which we're able to keep our country safe, and we also need to find ways in which we enable genuine liberty and freedom of communication. Now, these things are a balance. It's not a secret, I'm afraid. It is a balance, and it is a difficult one. But the reality is that security is not about silence, at least not in a free society like ours. It's about empowerment. If you get security right, then what you do is you allow freedom of communication, you allow freedom of association, you allow ideas and innovation. if you get it wrong, either by being too secure or not secure enough, and not secure enough is a danger as well, then what you enable is you enable the violent voices of outrage or control to silence genuine debate and genuine innovation. So the balance is an important one to get right, and there isn't an absolute, though I take your point.
Colvin, on either question.
Yeah, I completely agree with the Minister, surprisingly. But balance, and the balance point is actually something we call the CX side thing, the customer experience side thing. And we haven't said the word yet, but the algorithms. What people are looking for, and we see this both public sector and private sector servicing, is ease of use. Everybody wants one click and you've got it, right? And one click and I've bought it, one click and I've moved through. And that balance between the customer experience, the frictionless service, the fantastic way it all works, coupled with the safety and security. So that's the balance and the challenge we always see in, if you're going to put other levels of authentication and security, how do you retain the balance? Because users, customers, are quite fleet of foot. If someone has a much quicker way of doing it, suddenly they'll move over there. And that's where the sort of sense of, well, is that a secure, is that an issue? It doesn't really come high up the priority chain until something goes wrong, and we all know that. So there's that balance that we always see around design, customer experience, how easy is it to use, how can you maintain the security levels while you're doing it. I was going to say that we're still in the Wild West in some of the stuff around social media, but we're not. It has matured extensively. We understand the vulnerabilities. We understand how people are using it. We have to stay ahead of it. But what does happen is the landscape keeps changing, and our security posture has to keep adapting. Security experts are, by the way, I'm not. I have to say, I can talk a good game, but I'm not the expert. But they'll tell you extensively about posture and how you have to keep lining yourself up against as the landscape changes. What I see now is them literally dancing at 100 miles an hour because they're having to adapt so fast to the change in the landscape. So I think there's the landscape to keep abreast of and stay ahead of. There's the need to keep it easy, frictionless, and design service so you don't lose people because they feel that they could just do it easier somewhere else.
Thank you. We'll have the lady in the front row, and we will have the gentleman in the row back at the back there. Yes, you, sir. Thank you.
Paula Wren, just a member from North Wilts. I've always been very careful when I get these spam emails from banks or people pretending to be banks. I always try and send them to the appropriate place. Sometimes it's spoof at so-and-so, sometimes it's fraud, sometimes it's phishing. I suggested a few years ago via my MP to have a simple website like fraud@fraud.com, and any of these emails you just forward to that, and it will be a central collection system, and they can send them to whoever. There is something like that now, but it's a little bit bureaucratic. So really it's simplicity, and the other thing is publicity. If you can have remember the clunk click every trip? If you have a motto like that for never click, I can't think of the rest, but you know, there's a challenge for you.
Is there a question?
Is there any, can you say where the government can actually make something like this happen? It's simplicity, you know, to make it really simple and easy for people to report when they get these spam messages and emails.
Thank you. Sir?
Yes, thank you. Matthew Ballard with BCW Global, ally from across the pond in Washington, D.C., if you can tell by the accent. And just wanted to understand, going back to cyber crimes and the evolving cyber threat landscape, what role, if any, does the rise of digital assets like cryptocurrencies, NFTs, play in the proliferation of this threat landscape? And what can be done, both from a cyber defense but also from a financial regulatory process to address this?
Thank you. To vary the batting, shall we start with Kulveer this time?
Well, it's really interesting about cryptocurrencies because it's essentially built on something that's meant to be really secure, which is the blockchain model. So the irony of one of the most secure new ways of actually securing data is becoming one of the big vulnerabilities because of how it's being utilized in terms of a commodity that people want. That really is the Wild West. And I think that the challenge is how are we going to accommodate that emergence of these currencies, which are going to continue. There is no way this is going to move away into our financial infrastructure. People are looking at this and saying, right, quite honestly, we will be dealing in cryptocurrencies in a few years' time, if we're not already. I think probably some people may be exposed to them already. But the safety and security of them will depend on not how they're designed, but how we use them. And I think that's the transactional point that brings the vulnerability in. Just as any transaction has that vulnerability, the use of crypto in transaction will be the vulnerable side. And that's where retail, all the traditional businesses that will be starting to use them, will have to come up and understand how are they going to protect each side. But I think the other side of it around how do you get the message out, as another message tunes up behind me, it is going to be something that we have to awaken people to, because actually a lot of people are secure in their cybersecurity. So if you're in an ecosystem, I won't mention which firm this is, but one of the biggest firms in the world that makes lots of money, you're within the ecosystem. That means this phone is connected to their cloud, which is connected to your watch, and you don't think about cybersecurity unless you have to upgrade the operating system. So whether people think that they're secure or not depends on how much they trust this firm, and the firm is delivering that security. It's when you step outside it and start going to other things, and this links back to crypto. If I start to engage, that's where I open the vulnerability. And I think the messaging isn't so much to say people, don't click, don't clunk, don't go. It's to be aware of which ecosystem you're inhabiting. And when you move from one to the other, then be aware. Now, it's a bit of a complicated message, but I think that's where we're going to have to focus as we go forward.
So I think the idea of messaging is important, and there's always more that the government can do. So I'll bear that in mind, because there's always enough need to update according to the technology that's available. And your point about crypto, I think, is entirely valid, and I hear Calveer's right. It's how do you deal with systems that don't operate on the same state basis? How do you deal with encryption at a level that means that ransomware is more profitable now than it has been in the past? How do you deal with these different aspects? Now, the reality, of course, is crypto isn't secret. One of the things about crypto is, by definition, it's public. But it's how do you download that currency into what I think what most people would consider to be real assets, whether those are dollars or cars or whatever they happen to be. So I think there is a challenge there for countries. I think there's also a challenge there for companies, and finding that balance is essential, because we don't think much about the exchange mechanism that we use. I mean, actually, the reality is almost all money in the world today is electronic money, and Bitcoin is one kind, but the biggest electronic currency in the world today is the dollar. I don't mean the e-dollar, I mean the actual dollar. I mean, most dollars in the world are just a collection of noughts and ones on a database, really. That's all they are. So the reality is that finding ways to deal with crypto is actually talking about how do we defend our own economic security going forward.
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of reporting portals, most of, I think, what you're looking for exists, but we are not fantastic at pointing them out to you and letting people know that they are there, and they're not in one place, which would be a very helpful way of doing things. There's also a problem there which, as we've already discussed with action fraud, but there are cyber reporting hotlines. If you don't see anything happen when you report, what's your incentive to keep doing it? And so you may do it the first time, and then when you don't hear anything back, and you don't see a website being taken down, or you get the same scam appear in your email again, why do you think what you've done's made a difference? And we need that feedback loop. We need to improve that. In terms of crypto and the challenges there, so in my old job, what we used to see was illicit money flows starting wherever, whether it was low-level fraud and scams, whether it was the criminal gangs running small boats across the channel. They would take the money into the country, they would launder it through various schemes, and then they would exit it generally to Eastern Europe, and because of transnational borders, it became incredibly difficult to then follow it, chase it, shut those gangs down, get those assets back. My understanding is now much of that has gone online, it's gone to crypto, because it is just infinitely easier to move that money and move it just like that. You're absolutely right, Kulveer is absolutely right, that is supposedly a traceable currency, but there's a point where it just gets too difficult to do, and our law enforcement teams just aren't resourced well enough to go after some of this stuff. So again, we let it fly. So there's a lot more we should be doing in terms of using the proceeds of economic crime that we do seize to better resource the teams we have in law enforcement to deal with it. And I'd just make one final point on this. We've got to be really careful what we wish for here. So digital currencies are all well and good, and you know, I am actually a big supporter of them, but you've got to be aware of what you're handing over when you move to digital currencies. So the digital yuan, for instance, which is thriving, means that the state can see what you're spending your money on, when you spend it, who with. Now that's a level of control which, of course, China is very, very happy to have. I am less comfortable, even though I trust the Bank of England, to let the Bank of England know what I'm spending my money on and how I'm shopping on Amazon and why I'm doing it at 4 in the morning. These are the sorts of things which I consider private, but that is what a state-backed digital currency would mean to some degree, and we've got to address these challenges, and we're not having that debate in public yet.
Can I jump in on the back of that? Because I think there's a really interesting question on privacy here. And Simon's point is absolutely correct. Who you share with and what you share is a choice that you have to make. But we share an extraordinary amount with Amazon and Tesco and, you know, Netflix and any number of different people. I mean, Google knows where I am every hour of every day. I remember having a conversation with a Google executive who was talking about privacy and about the fact that GCHQ were asking certain questions about various people. And I said, but you literally track me every single second of every day. You read and search every email I write and target advertising to me based on what I've emailed my friends about. Now, you don't actually read it in the sense that you know there's somebody on the other end reading it, but you literally have algorithms doing it so that you can sell to me. Your level of intrusion is the like of which the Chinese state could only dream of up until a few years ago. And yet we're concerned about the state that has legal oversights, representation, you know, and all the other sort of things that go with a democratic establishment. So I think we do need to have a conversation about this. But then Kulveer mentioned Apple. Sorry, you didn't mention Apple. Kulveer mentioned another technology system. Look, the different ways in which, you know, information is collected on us all and the way in which we cooperate with that collection is a conversation that needs to include the corporate world as well as the government. And I think we need to have an honest conversation about what the difference is between the two. Because if you think you have influence over companies, I'm afraid you haven't dealt with them quite as much as you think.
Actually, on that, I'm going to usurp Chair's prerogative again. I'm going to ask a question. This is for the whole panel, but because I think you all have different areas of interest. One of the themes that's come up in this debate so far is how quickly this sphere changes. There's constantly new technology, constantly trying. So what I'm curious about is, what are we not talking about yet? That if we had this panel in a year, if we had this panel in 2 or 3 years, what will we be talking about then that we're maybe not talking about now? What's on the horizon in terms of cybersecurity and the threats that we might face in future?
You're looking at me, Henry, so
I have to look at somebody, and
okay.
People can only hear me when I look forward, so it's a great dilemma. But,
well, what I'll say is, I think we can talk about the technology, and as a technology provider, we'll talk about technology endlessly and switch most people off. I think what we will need to be talking about is behavior. And I don't mean that behavior of everyone else who's sitting out here in this panel right now. I actually mean behavior of what were the digital natives and whichever generation is coming through now, because their adoption of technology is completely different to how we perceive it. And you see it in a work environment with how people are coming through. And by the way, the pandemic has turbocharged this change as well, because it had a huge impact on the way people are working. So now, there isn't that perception that you will go to an office and be in a secure environment to work. You could be working from literally anywhere, anytime. And it's not something that's optional. It's something that people say is absolutely something they want. And they won't do the job unless they get the flexibility to work wherever they want. And that's a generational change shift as well. So behavior, whether it's about work, whether it's about how you operate in any given environment, how you use social media. I know Tom highlighted the fact that, things are available online about their history. Well, now a lot of them don't really mind. They want their TikTok dances and they want their Insta, and it's because they become influencers. And it's moved from, actually, I'd be a bit embarrassed about having that, to actually, I can commoditize that. So the shifting in behavior is radically changing, and we have to stay in tune with that. So as much as it's around the technology and the availability of it, it's what it does to behavior, the adoption, and how the next generation move through that.
Thank you. Tom?
I think that's an important point, actually. I think Culver's point about cultural change is I think, the main one that we're going to engage with. I mean, it's, as I said, there are many of us who grew up in a non-digital world who now are not digital natives, and the reality is that different people growing up today have different levels of tolerance. I mean, there is a long series of papers on the invention of privacy in the late 1800s or in the early 1800s as people moved out of villages and into communities, more urban communities. And you could argue that this is just the latest stage of the invention of privacy as a concept, and indeed, therefore, its erosion. So it's a much wider argument, but it will be interesting to see how that conversation continues, because it also raises many other questions. It raises questions of forgiveness and memory. It raises questions of the structure of society and forgetfulness, and all of those societal constructs that we have created, used, invented, if you like, are going to be coming up to play in very different ways. So I'm very curious to see how behavioral scientists will talk in coming years. And if you talk to big tech companies these days, they seem to be investing, well, maybe not as much, but an awful lot in behavioral science, as they are in coding and developing and various other things.
Thank you. Simon?
Thank you. So I agree with all of those. I think we're also going to be talking much more about AI and machine learning and how decisions are made for us by these systems we're creating. I think a lot of the challenges which we've talked about today are about speed and the rapidity of decision making. That's only going to increase, and I think we're going to be addressing that. And the one thing I hope we're not still talking about, although I didn't bring it up in my opening remarks, which I should have done, is the Computer Misuse Act and reform of that. It is bonkers to me that we are reliant on a law that dates back from when we had floppy disks and before the common internet existed to look after what the rules are for our cyber defence and how we equip people and skill people to properly defend us. We need to reform this piece of legislation really quite urgently.
How urgently, Tom? Is that on the...
Well, it's actually something I've already begun conversations about, so yes, urgently.
Excellent. Okay, right, show of hands again. We'll have the lady in the second row there and the gentleman there. Thank you very much. That one, thank you very much.
Yeah, it's Millie Beaver from Tobias Howard MP's office. We've briefly spoken about China, but I was wondering whether Tom specifically thinks that we should be staying close with China or pushing forward with decoupling, and whether or not it really is just a double-edged sword for our cybersecurity.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you. Michael, just a concerned citizen. Simon spoke about AI, and what I want to know from the government is, what are you currently doing to protect us against things like big data and profiling and using AI?
Okay, thank you very much. I guess the logical person to start with is Tom.
So let me start off on the conversation with China. I mean, the challenge of China is, what do you mean? How far back do you want to go? Every chip, well, not just every chip, every lubricant in this country is made with high purity industrial silicon. 90% of that is made in China. What do you want to decouple from? We need to have a really serious conversation about where we are integrated, where we need to cooperate, and where we need to be cautious. This is why Taiwan's democracy matters so much. It's why the investment that we need to make in alliances and partnerships around the world matter so much. Because the reality is that we have very, very strong connections to China, and it's very difficult to move them on. Now, I think we need to do more to make sure that we have resilience, but we should also be realistic and say that, if you want to know why inflation rates have been low in the entire world for 30 years, it's because manufacturing in China has been cheap. And the reality is that that investment in massive productivity gains in electronics that we've seen in 20, 30 years has been because China has been able to produce electronics at a much cheaper rate. In fact, many products at a much cheaper rate with much greater output than others. So I'd be cautious about talking about decoupling, but that doesn't mean we don't need to talk about defense and protection, because the reality is that there are Chinese companies, there's one that's already been mentioned, which advertise themselves as entertainment platforms or social media platforms or various other different platforms, that when you read their terms and conditions, they are collecting every single keystroke you make on your computer and your phone, even when you're not using the app. So every password, every email that you write, every single keystroke you make on them is being collected. And it's there, it's in black and white, it's in the terms and conditions, you agreed it when you downloaded the app. And yet people still do it. So I think we do need to be cautious about that. On the, forgive me, sir, you asked about...
Artificial intelligence.
Sorry?
Protection from AI, on AI.
Oh yes, AI protection. Again, I'm very cautious about making promises that can't be kept. It is very difficult to write laws against mathematics. What we need to be doing is making sure that we embed cultural understanding within our own society as to where the risks are, and we engage with businesses to make sure that we protect, that we work with responsible businesses and allow them to work properly. But the nature of digital communications is that it is online and it is international. And while we can do so much, we need to make sure that we're all aware of the reality of the threat, and we don't pretend that we can legislate against mathematical innovation. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, well, just one thing you could potentially legislate against, is there actually a legitimate case for apps allowing themselves to track every keystroke, or potentially is that something that the government could simply prohibit?
Well, this is the problem, you can prohibit some of it, in the sense that you can prohibit their downloading in the United Kingdom or something like that. But as you know, for those of you who've got relatives, or you yourselves may have foreign, you may have some links to another country. You can download a French app store from Apple, or you can download an American one, or you can download a Saudi one, or you can download... So you can register your phone in different places, in which case our laws don't have much effect.
No, but I suppose the argument would be it would stop people inadvertently. You have to go to quite a lot of effort to go and download a different country app store.
And Apple make sure that they monetize that difference.
Fair enough. Right. Show of hands again, please. We'll have the gentleman there, and someone from this side of the room, the gentleman in the front row there. Thank you very much.
Jeremy Bernard Ray, retired from the city to a bucolic Wantage and Didcot constituency. Minister, I'd like to go for you, even though Simon made a similar point. The first central point you made was that we have no culture of reporting. And you, sir, may be in a position to help us with that, because not only is there no incentive to report, there are actual punishments for people who report. Very often the evil is attributed to the reporter in corporate terms. The self-destructive hypocrisy of
what's the question?
A reporting obligation which almost always punishes reporters is something which I think the Minister, HMG, could do something about. Do you have any constructive proposals to deal with the no culture of reporting, which you briefly mentioned and glossed over?
Sorry, I didn't actually say there was no culture of reporting. I said not as many reports go in as one would like. There is a very high culture of reporting in many businesses, and a large number of, the banking sector was brought up earlier. are exceptionally good at reporting, even minor attacks. They are very, very responsible on this, and many other large companies are as well. Where it becomes an issue is what Simon was talking about, which is when you're a small company and you've got 1,000 things to do. The reality is that reporting may take up a period of time that actually, you know, if anybody who's run a small business knows that the number of little jobs that you have to do take up more than 24 hours a day, and none of them include making money for the business that you're trying to run. So it's just very, very difficult for many people to find the time. Now, there are ways in which we can do more, and there are conversations we can have with the insurance industry on this as well, because a large number of insurance payouts, you know, depend on companies reporting, and we need to then make sure that that communication chain, as it were, carries on. So I do think there's an awful lot we can do, and I think there's more encouragement we can do.
Sir.
Hello, you can hear me. My name's Russell Perrin. I'm a leader of Harlow Council. I'm also a teacher as well, and I'm really interested around the cultural discussion, because what I cannot seem to understand is the government doesn't really seem to lead on the culture when it becomes social media use with children. We talk about education quite a lot, but usually we're educating somebody after the accidents happen. So if you look back through history, my grandfather would have been allowed to take a penknife to school, but the culture's changed. In the 80s, we used to be able to walk around, go around without a seatbelt on. The culture changed. We used to play with fireworks in the street. The culture changes. But we don't seem to have a drive with children that it's culturally wrong to be on social media platforms sharing all of your wares, because they are not hitherto aware of all of the consequences that you've talked about here on the stage today. And I think if there was a bigger cultural change, instead of a glamorization of social media, without becoming a Mary Whitehouse figure, I think there would be a bigger change. So what is the government going to do, or are they going to continue to talk about, rightly, it's difficult to legislate against mathematics, but we can push the culture, we can drive this and say, look, give the children back their freedom. We can create a culture where you can be free. That, I want to know what the government's going to do about that, if at all anything.
So I think that's a really sorry.
Go ahead.
I think that's a really interesting question, and the challenge is, frankly, that the government is only one part of this conversation. I mean, I've done a little bit of teaching a long time ago, so I'm well out of date. But I suspect one thing that hasn't changed is that although schools have a huge influence on young people's lives, parents have more. And I remember when I was teaching, there was a child who made some racist comments, and talking to them about it, and they understood this. And a few days later, they came in and made similar comments again, and I went to see the head teacher, and they went, well, that's what they hear at home. It's very difficult to do anything about it. The same is true, I'm afraid, with social media. You know, you're absolutely right. The government can talk about it and schools can help educate. But if all your friends are doing the same thing, if your family doesn't help you stop it, it can be very, very difficult to resist it. Now, this is where we really need to be having a conversation much more widely, because it's not just the nature of the culture, it's also the nature of the business. And I think we need to be honest that publishers like Facebook and Twitter, publishers that profit specifically from your engagement in the items that they're publishing, are publishers in the same way as the printers of the 1700s or 1800s were. They write the algorithm to maximize the profit. That is literally what they do. They then claim they have no responsibility for what goes on the platform and that they're a pinboard. Well, if they're a pinboard, then there's no algorithm. If they're a pinboard, they're just an empty website. But they're not. In order to profit from the business, they have to write an algorithm that maximizes interaction. That's why they're a publisher.
Simon.
Thank you. And it's a really good question. It's not often I stand up for the social media companies, but I will here. So Google offer a fantastic resource covering just this. I forget what it's called, digital classrooms or something, but I'm sure if you Google it, you will find it. So do other organisations, HSBC, Barclays. I led a piece of work about 5 years ago to try and get some form of cyber skills looking at internet safety, being careful about what you share and understanding what the risks of going online are. Tried to get that into the curriculum, and it was an uphill struggle. I haven't quite given up on it yet, because I do think these are essential life skills that we should be equipping children with, and they should be core curriculum, given the fact that these are now core life, and not something fringe that the occasional person uses. But there are resources out there, and if you need signposting to any of them, I'm sure you don't, I'm sure you know exactly where you're looking, I'm happy to point you in the right direction.
Colville, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think the cultural point is essential. One of the things I'd say on this is that we've spoken a lot about awareness and responsibility, but design, and we talk about algorithms, we talk about devices, we talk about platforms. The people who are co-creating and innovating can come from quite a narrow pool and can be quite similar in their thinking. And one of the challenges and risks you see is that sort of groupthink and the obvious not being highlighted until it's already embedded, it's already happening, and then we're sitting there going, how did this happen? And as the non-techie, and I am absolutely the non-techie, the minister maybe, then I'll be second. But it's always, I think, the other thing we have to look at is making sure we have the right, diversity and diversity of thought in the room at a design phase of services and what we're trying to achieve. Because you were talking about, how do we get ahead of this before the problem occurs? I find it's linear thinking that lets something get to the point that it's a problem because we didn't challenge it early enough by having different thought, different people as part of that process of co-creation and design. And I think that's essential if we're going to try and head these things off early.
Thank you. Show of hands again, please. We'll have the lady in the second row there and the gentleman in the second row there. Thank you.
My name is Sanjana. I work at ISC Squared. We are a cybersecurity membership association. My question actually builds on the statement that Kulveer just made. All of you mentioned skills in your opening remarks. What do you think are the main barriers to joining the profession, and especially when there are, so many tech-savvy young people, why are they not considering a career in cyber as they consider a career in other professions and occupations?
Thank you. Sir?
Hi, my name's Mark Leffley. I'm a director at a communications firm called Powers Corp. The advance in cyber attacks and data dumping in particular are central reasons for the reform of the Official Secrets Act as part of the National Security Bill. One of the most important reforms, potentially, is the introduction of a statutory public interest defence, which Robert Buckland has argued for on Conservative Home, particularly for the reason that it would actually deal with this problem of data dumpers. The second reading of the bill and the committee amendment, New Clause 6, shows that a public interest defence has significant and widespread cross-party support. Tom, will you accept that amendment, or would you come back with a variation of it?
I'm going to answer that very quickly and say I will have to talk to others about that because it's not my bill.
You're sponsoring it.
Sorry.
The way it works is one government department leads on a bill, and they get to shape it. I'm one of the sponsors of it.
Colville, come in on the
Careers. We have lots of jobs. We need young people. Well, we need people, actually. It doesn't have to be young. We've done a lot in our business, actually, of shifting skills from where we have lots of people and things are changing in the requirements around technology to training them into cybersecurity. And believe you me, if they see the salaries that are now available in cybersecurity, they will want to be in cybersecurity. It's very much competitive to, it being in the city and anywhere else, because the skills are essential. As I said, we have 6,000 experts. We could easily quadruple that and employ every single one of them. I think that some of the challenges are that people don't see the role in their academic career early enough. We all know in the traditional form of schooling that, you could understand IT and technology, but the specifics around, in fact, the gentleman here, before we started to talk, he was asking about his son, who's considering whether it was cybersecurity or programming. And what would be better? And I thought, two fantastic choices. Choose the one you're going to enjoy most with his son. Because it's the earlier that we can get in the academic process, people to see the opportunity, that they'll flow into it. And I think dare I say, there's something that needs to be normalized around working in those environments. For a while, it's been seen as mainly a male-dominated environment. We have to get more women and girls involved in coding. It's been said many times. But also, it has to look cool. Right? Working in this environment has to look cool. And I have to say, I think it is becoming cool. If I look at the intake that we're getting in our business, I have to say the younger people as they come in, they look cool. They feel like they're enjoying it. There's a style. It feels to me like how it was cool maybe in different jobs and career and professions before. Cyber technology is becoming very cool. So I hope we will get more. But I think we're going to have to keep feeding the machine, because the more services, the more design, more technology, we need more people. So we just need to attract more.
Simon.
Thank you, and I agree with everything you've just said, which will cut down my answer considerably. So I think part of it is about promoting the industry, and it's talking about the opportunities there and what interesting roles there are. I also think we're at the beginning of what I hope will be a long trail of people joining. So we've seen significant efforts by the government through falling down through the cybersecurity strategy of things like the National Cyber Force being created, which will help raise that profile, will help start to build the skills. And I can talk to that as a constituency MP. In my patch, we are having the first university campus that Barrow has ever had, which is going to be cybersecurity focused, working with the University of Lancaster, who's already doing lots of work in that space, and University of Cumbria. So we're going to start seeing people coming through that pipeline very quickly, which I'm delighted about. The other thing, we have already mentioned it, is the Computer Misuse Act. I do think this is such a barrier to that when people are looking at interesting jobs where they will be on the side of the angels, probing systems, making sure that actually they are secure, that foreign states, people who want to harm us can't get into our systems and damage them, and they can be prosecuted themselves for doing that job. We need to remove those barriers and make sure that actually when people get the skills, come work for us, they're not at risk. This is clearly keeping people away from the industry.
Thank you. Final show of hands, please. We'll have the lady in the front row and the gentleman behind her there with in the third row. Thank you very much. And this will be probably the last round of questions, looking at the time. So thank you very much.
Joan Concannon from the University of York. So building on the skills agenda that you've just talked about, Simon, we've just launched an Institute for Safe Autonomy, which is providing large-scale testing facilities for industry to test the safety assurance of autonomous systems and robotics, which clearly has an implication for security. How else do you envisage working with the research sector of universities? How can we help drive this agenda, not just from a skills perspective?
Thank you.
Ephraim Karlebach from Parliamentary Insight. Everyone can subscribe on Substack for parliamentary briefings. Encoding Values, the Select Committee report from Tom's old Foreign Affairs Committee. Just two quick points on that. One was the need to keep British companies in technology, strategic sensitive areas in the UK. One of the examples was ARM in Cambridge. Now, the change in government, but also the fall in the pound, is making it look less likely that ARM will stay in the UK and might go to the NASDAQ for an IPO. And also the fall in the pound might make it more likely that other companies are going to get bought out by foreign investors in strategic areas. How do we deal with that tension? And on the digital deciders in that report, countries like India, we're currently negotiating a free trade agreement with India. Are we or should we be putting conditions about cybersecurity into those free trade agreements? And if so, what should they be?
Thank you. So we'll just move down the panel. I think you can address the questions in your closing remarks. So
very quickly on universities, there is an awful lot more to do. I was with DSTL the other day, who are at the heart of much UK governmental innovation, as you know, and they're a phenomenal organisation, staffed by some of the most extraordinary people I've had the privilege to meet. They work very closely with the university sector, and many other areas do. The National Cybersecurity Centre does as well. And I know that there's an awful lot more they'd like to do, and they're looking at different ways in which we engage. So I hope very much they'll be speaking to you. I know they speak to many others. I'm delighted that you read Foreign Affairs Committee reports. They were written very carefully. So I've been pretty vocal over the years that there are two decisions that I thought were particularly unstrategic that were tolerated in the past, and one was ARM and the other was DeepMind. And I'm very careful not to criticize the companies in question, because the reason they did it is because they had bluntly, they had a pretty simple choice: either sell the company or watch their staff get salami sliced out by offers from other companies overseas. And you're right, it is a challenge. It's a real challenge as to how you maintain economic sovereignty, which is part of economic security. And this is something I've spoken about a lot in the past, and now in some ways comes under the brief I hold. I would argue that there's a really important part of reform that we need to see in changing the connection between the bond industry and the pension funds, and liberating quite a lot of that dead capital and turning it into live capital, so that what we do is we inject real investment into jobs and innovations of the future, which is, after all, that's what equities are. So I hope very much that what we'll be seeing is a real change in the pool of capital available to firms, so that we don't find companies like DeepMind, who didn't have a choice, having to go to the United States, or ARM having to go to Japan, because this isn't just about hostile states, China or Russia buying a company, mostly China these days, but China or Russia buying a company and therefore stealing IP. This is also about having an infrastructure, an economic infrastructure, which supports innovation and ideas, and so that you grow an entire ecosystem of technology into the future.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, and I believe this is closing remarks too, so I'll address one of your points, which I think sums up a lot of what we've been talking around ARM and other organisations. We have a department that has industrial strategy in its title, but yet we seem to be unwilling to embrace the idea of an industrial strategy. And yet this isn't about us picking winners. This is about us laying out what our concerns are and how we start to address them. We can't be reliant on countries who, with one hand, we need to take services from, we need to take technology from, but at the other hand, we simply don't trust, and we don't trust their intentions. So we've got to be better at building resilience in our own country, and that means picking critical areas of national concern and backing them and securing them. It means building skills and making sure that we've got the resilience in our workforce so that we can secure ourselves and that we can be a leader in this space. And to Tom's point, it's about making sure we've got that ecosystem in place. Because if we don't, we're just going to slowly fragment this sector, and we're going to become more and more vulnerable as a result of it.
Thank you. And to play us out, Fulvio.
Yes, the tune continues. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Minister for his time today. We've covered quite a breadth and depth of topics under the arena of cybersecurity, and I think it goes to show just how much there is for us to consider. And please, I will do a bit of a plug. Please do take our latest booklet. It's called Cybersecurity 3. That's because there have been 2 previous versions over the last 5 years, and it's because the landscape does keep changing and evolving. And I think one of the things we as a business want to do, and I personally want to do, is ensure that we continue a dialogue, because we're one of those businesses in the background that are working hard to keep up with the challenge of cybersecurity. But I think we need to bring it to the foreground. The more we're part of the education, part of the dialogue is to have these things going on. But the other part is the skills side. You mentioned the university. Another plug would be that I also sit on the board of Tech UK. And Atos and Tech UK are working to look at how we can bring digital skills and develop the digital skill pipeline across the country via levelling up. And we've called it innovating up, because there are jobs and employers dotted around the UK who are looking for cyber skills, digital skills locally. And I think we need to maybe go to where those jobs are and work as anchor employers, work with local communities to help the pipeline of skills and jobs as well, because that's been a fundamental part of the discussion today. So sorry for lobbing that in right at the end. But yes, thank you, the Minister. Thanks, Henry, and thank you, Simon.
I hope everyone will join me in a show of appreciation for our panel. Thank you so much for joining us at Conservative Home today. I hope that we'll see you at some of our events we're running this afternoon and tomorrow. But now, you're free to leave. Thank you for joining us.